They thought the cowboy was helpless, not knowing he was allies with 77 Apache warriors. The sun had barely risen over the horizon when the cowboy stepped out of his small cabin. The morning air was crisp and filled with the smell of dry earth and sagebrush. His hat was pulled low over his eyes, and his boots crunched softly on the dirt as he walked toward the fence that surrounded his modest property. For anyone passing by, he looked like an ordinary man, living alone on the edge of the wild frontier. A man who might be weak, even helpless, but those who thought that were wrong. The cowboy had lived in these lands for many years. He knew every rock, every hidden trail, every whisper of wind that passed through the hills. He had learned to read the signs that others missed, the tracks of animals, the broken twigs where a stranger had walked, the distant calls of birds that warned of danger. Life here was hard, but it had made him strong and clever. He did not rely on luck. He relied on skill, patience, and his sharp mind. As he looked over his land, he noticed the quiet stillness. There were no sounds of movement beyond the normal calls of nature. Yet he could feel something in the air, a sense that the peace of the morning was fragile. Rumors had reached him over the past week. A gang of bandits, ruthless and greedy, was moving toward this area. They wanted to steal cattle, take what they could, and leave fear behind them. Many of the settlers nearby had already fled, believing that nothing could stop the gang. Most of them had no idea who the cowboy truly was. To them, he was just a man living alone. They thought he was an easy target, a man without allies or power. But appearances were deceiving. The cowboy had secrets, and those secrets would soon prove that he was anything but helpless. The cabin behind him was small but sturdy. Its walls were made of thick logs, worn smooth by years of wind and sun. Smoke curled from the chimney, a sign that the fire inside burned bright and steady. Inside, he had stored his tools, his weapons, and the supplies that might one day save his life. Every item had its place. Every detail mattered. He did not leave things to chance. Survival here depended on preparation. The cowboy's mind was sharp and clear, thinking ahead, always aware of possibilities. He knew the gang might arrive at any moment. He also knew that facing them alone would be foolish. But he was not alone. Not really. He had spent years building a relationship with a group of Apache warriors. They were strong, brave, and disciplined. 77 of them had sworn loyalty to him, not because he forced them, but because he had earned their respect. He had helped them in the past, defended their lands, and treated them fairly. In turn, they had chosen to trust him and stand with him when danger came. The cowboy had been careful. No one in the nearby settlements knew about the Apache warriors. It was a secret he guarded closely. If the bandits had any idea that he was not alone, they might think twice. But the cowboy wanted them to underestimate him. There was power in being underestimated. It gave him an advantage. He moved slowly along the fence line, checking the condition of the wood and the gates. His eyes were alert, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. In the distance, the hills rose sharply, dotted with rocks and shrubs. That was where he would position his allies if the gang arrived. Hidden from sight, ready to strike. He thought about the traps he had set, the clever paths through the terrain that would confuse any intruder. Every step, every plan had been carefully considered. Despite all his preparation, there was a quiet tension inside him. The cowboy had faced danger before, but he never underestimated it. The bandits were clever, ruthless, and dangerous. Many had reputations that sent chills through the frontier. Yet he did not let fear control him. Fear could cloud judgment, and judgment was what he needed most. He took a deep breath, feeling the morning air fill his lungs, steadying himself for what might come. In the small town nearby, rumors of the cowboy spread quickly. Some people whispered about him with doubt. "He's just a man alone," they said. "There's no way he can stop them." Others, who had glimpsed his skills from a distance, spoke with quiet respect. "He's clever," they admitted. "Don't underestimate him." But most of the settlers did not understand the truth. They could not see the network of alliances, the hidden strengths, the years of careful planning. They only saw the man on his land and assumed he was weak. As the day moved forward, the cowboy prepared for the possibility of confrontation. He cleaned his rifle, checking every mechanism, every sight. He polished his boots and adjusted his hat. His movements were calm, precise, and deliberate. There was no panic in him, only a quiet focus. He walked to a small hill near his cabin, where he could look out over the land. The sun was climbing higher, casting long shadows across the ground. It would not be long before the gang arrived. While he observed, he thought about the Apache warriors who would soon join him. Each one was skilled in ways that matched the ruggedness of this land. They could move silently through forests, scale rocks without a sound, and strike with precision that many would not believe. The cowboy had studied their tactics, learned their methods, and built trust through years of cooperation. Together, they were more than just a cowboy and a group of warriors. They were a force that could change the outcome of any battle. He smiled faintly to himself. "Let them come," he thought. "Let them think I am helpless. Let them believe they have the advantage. They will soon learn how wrong they are." As the afternoon approached, the sounds of nature were interrupted by the faint whistle of the wind across the plains. The cowboy's sharp eyes caught movement in the distance, a cloud of dust rising too large to be caused by animals. His heart did not race, but his senses sharpened. The bandits were coming. They were closer than he had anticipated. He stepped back from the hill and began to make final preparations. He checked the hidden signals he had set for the Apache warriors. Simple markers, barely noticeable, would alert them to move into position. Every detail had been thought through. He moved quietly through his cabin, adjusting supplies, double-checking weapons, and ensuring that everything was ready. It was a ritual he had repeated many times, a calm before the storm. The cowboy's thoughts drifted briefly to the people in the nearby settlements. Many had fled in fear, but some had stayed behind, hoping for protection, or too stubborn to leave. He knew that his actions might save lives, and that thought gave him strength. Courage was not the absence of fear, it was action in the presence of fear. And he was ready to act. As the sun dipped lower, casting an orange glow across the plains, the cowboy took one last look at the horizon. Dust clouds were rising, confirming that the gang was moving closer. He did not flinch. Instead, he moved with calm determination, ready to face whatever came next. For those who thought he was helpless, a surprise awaited. They could not see the allies waiting in the shadows, the careful traps set along the hills, or the brilliant strategies forming in the mind of a man who had survived the frontier through skill, patience, and courage. The cowboy's strength was quiet, hidden, and underestimated. That was exactly how he wanted it. And so, the stage was set. A lone man, a secret army of 70 Apache warriors, and a gang that believed they had the advantage. The battle was not yet fought, but the first moves were already in place. The cowboy, standing on the hill, watched the approaching dust and felt a calm certainty. He was ready. The world might think him weak, but he knew the truth. He was never alone, and soon the entire frontier would learn it too. The cowboy moved quietly through the tall grass at the edge of his land. keeping his eyes on the horizon. Dust clouds continued to rise in the distance, marking the approach of the gang. Their confidence was clear. They believed they would find an easy target. But the cowboy did not worry. He had friends who were skilled, loyal, and brave. The 77 Apache warriors he had allied with were already moving into position, guided by the secret signals he had set earlier. The relationship between the cowboy and the Apache warriors was built on trust and respect. Years ago, he had helped them when they needed protection from outside threats. He had never betrayed them, never taken advantage, and always treated them as equals. In return, they had shared their knowledge of the land, taught him their ways of moving silently through forests and hills, and trained him in strategies that few outsiders could understand. The warriors respected his bravery and his cleverness, and they had promised to stand by him when danger came. Today, that promise would be tested. In the hills and valleys around the cabin, the Apache warriors spread out, moving silently among the rocks and trees. Some climbed ridges to watch the plains below. Others hid in gullies and behind bushes. They positioned themselves at points where they could see the gang approaching but remained hidden. Every movement was careful, precise, and coordinated. They had been trained to act as one, following signals that were subtle but clear. To an outsider, it would seem as if the land itself were alive, moving against the intruders. The cowboy checked his rifle one last time, making sure it was ready. He adjusted the strap over his shoulder and walked to a small rise where he could see the road the bandits would take. The sun was high now, casting strong shadows across the plains. He could see the shapes of horses and wagons, hear faint shouts carried by the wind. The gang had no idea what awaited them. They were confident, even arrogant, thinking a lone man could not resist them. That confidence would soon be tested. He thought briefly about the people in the nearby settlements. Many had fled, but a few families remained, too proud or too fearful to leave. They had no idea that help was coming. Not from the settlers, not from lawmen, but from a man they underestimated and the warriors who had trained him. The cowboy knew that the battle ahead would be dangerous. Mistakes could cost lives. But he also knew that preparation, patience, and careful planning could turn the tide in ways that brute strength alone could not. As the gang drew closer, the cowboy began signaling to the Apache warriors. The signals were subtle: a stick bent in a certain way, a dust mark in the dirt, a whistle carried softly on the wind. Each warrior recognized the signs immediately. They adjusted their positions, moving silently to better spots. Some took higher ground to observe, while others hid in small gullies, waiting for the right moment to act. They were calm, disciplined, and ready. The first members of the gang reached the edge of the cowboys' land. They laughed among themselves, their horses kicking up dust as they rode forward. They had already begun dividing into smaller groups, looking for cattle and valuables. They believed the cowboy would offer no resistance. They were wrong. The cowboy watched carefully, waiting for the right moment. He could see the fearlessness in the gang's leader, a man known for taking risks. That confidence could be dangerous, but it also made him predictable. The cowboy had learned that people often act according to their habits and beliefs. By understanding that, he could control the situation. He raised his hand slightly, giving the first signal. A small group of Apache warriors shifted into place. They moved like shadows, silent and careful, following the terrain naturally. Their presence was invisible to the gang, but they were ready to act instantly if needed. The cowboy felt a sense of calm knowing they were nearby. He was never truly alone. Suddenly, one of the gang members wandered too close to a hidden trap the cowboy had set. A tripwire connected to a small device designed to startle and confuse. When it triggered, it made a loud noise, startling the horse and causing the man to stumble. The cowboy did not fire. He waited, confusion spread among the gang as they could not see what had caused the sudden disturbance. The cowboy knew fear worked faster than brute force. The gang paused, looking around nervously. They did not understand why their confident steps had been interrupted. That pause was all the cowboy needed. Another signal went out to the Apache warriors, who began small, coordinated actions to distract and divide the gang. Some made noises from behind rocks, others rustled through bushes, giving the impression that more people were present than there actually were. The gang became uneasy, questioning their own senses. The cowboy stayed calm on his rise, observing every movement. His eyes were sharp, taking in each detail: the placement of horses, the expressions on the gang members' faces, the shifting of shadows as the sun moved across the plains. He planned his next moves carefully, knowing that timing was everything. One wrong action could give the gang the advantage, but every sign he read confirmed that the plan was working. The gang had begun to lose confidence. Hours passed, and the sun continued its climb. The cowboy used the time to continue sending subtle signals, adjusting the positions of the warriors. When every movement was small but meaningful, designed to create maximum effect with minimal risk. The Apache warriors moved like ghosts across the land, unseen but ever present. They had trained for this, and their discipline showed. At one point, the gang split into smaller groups, thinking they could surround the cowboy and take him by surprise. But that was exactly what he had anticipated. Each group unknowingly moved into positions where the warriors could observe and control the situation. The cowboy smiled faintly, knowing that patience was his greatest weapon. The gang's confidence was eroding with every passing moment, replaced by unease and doubt. The cowboy also used the time to prepare his own defenses. He checked the cabin doors, reinforced weak points, and ensured that supplies were ready for any emergency. He was methodical and precise, leaving nothing to chance. Even the smallest details mattered, because he knew that the difference between victory and defeat often lay in preparation. As the afternoon wore on, the cowboys saw the gang growing restless. They had expected an easy target, but nothing was easy. The traps, the strange noises, and the hidden movements had unsettled them. Their confidence began to falter. Some whispered to each other nervously, while others grew frustrated, striking at the ground or shouting at imaginary enemies. They were beginning to realize that the man they thought helpless was far from it. The cowboy remained calm, sending one final signal to the warriors. It was time to show that the balance of power had already shifted. From their hidden positions, the Apache warriors began to move into more visible spots, careful to stay partially concealed. They did not attack yet. They only made their presence known, creating the impression of an overwhelming force. The gang's leaders squinted at the hills, realizing that they were not alone. Panic began to rise. The cowboy's mind was clear. He knew the next phase would be critical. He would need to act decisively, using strategy, skill, and the strength of his allies. But for now, the delay, the confusion, and the fear had already given him the advantage. The gang, once arrogant, was beginning to question every step. Every decision they made was slower, more cautious. They had walked into a plan they could not understand, controlled by a man they had underestimated. As the sun began to descend toward the horizon, the cowboy felt a familiar mix of tension and focus. He watched the shadows lengthen across the plains, imagining the moves the gang might make and how his allies could respond. The Apache warriors moved like living shadows, their presence both invisible and inevitable. The stage was set, the pieces in place. By evening, the gang had not realized the full extent of the forces aligned against them. They were confused, tired, and uneasy. The cowboy stood quietly on his rise, his eyes scanning the horizon, ready for the moment when strategy would become action. He knew that the coming night would test courage, patience, and skill. But he was ready. His allies were ready. And the gang, foolishly confident at first, had walked straight into a trap they did not even see. The cowboy smiled faintly. Let them come, he thought. They will soon learn that what they assumed was weakness was actually strength, patience, and unity. They believed he was helpless. They would soon discover that he had 70 warriors at his side, a careful plan, and the courage to defend his land and the people he had sworn to protect. And so, as night approached, the quiet plains held a tense calm. The cowboy and the Apache warriors waited, ready for the confrontation that would test every skill, every lesson, and every ounce of courage they possessed. The gang, unaware of what awaited them, continued toward their target, stepping ever closer into a plan they could not see and a force they had underestimated. The sun was dipping low over the horizon when the first members of the gang reached the edge of the cowboys' land. The warm glow of evening cast long shadows across the plains, making the hills and rocks appear larger and more mysterious. The cowboy watched quietly from a small rise, his eyes scanning every movement. Dust swirled around the horses' hooves, and the gang's laughter filled the air, unaware that every step they took was being observed by unseen eyes. The cowboy adjusted the strap of his rifle and lowered his hat slightly. His mind was calm, but every sense was alert. He knew the gang believed they had the advantage. They thought he was alone, that his land was undefended. But he had 70 Apache warriors hidden across the hills and valleys, ready to act at the perfect moment. They had moved into position silently, like shadows of the land itself, blending into rocks, trees, and gullies. He could see the gang splitting into smaller groups, each moving in a slightly different direction. Some were looking for cattle, others for supplies, and a few seemed simply curious about the land itself. They did not notice the traps set along the paths, the hidden snares, the tripwires, and the small devices meant to confuse them. Every detail had been carefully prepared to slow them down and unsettle them.
The cowboy raised his hand slightly, giving the first signal.
It was subtle, barely noticeable, but every Apache warrior knew exactly what it meant. A small group shifted silently, moving into positions where they could be seen without being attacked directly. The plan was not to strike immediately, but to create doubt, fear, and hesitation in the minds of the gang members. The first trap was triggered almost immediately. A tripwire hidden near a narrow path made a loud snapping sound. A rock loosened on purpose rolled down the slope, startling a horse and sending its rider stumbling. The cowboy stayed low, watching carefully. The gang had expected an easy path, but now they paused, confusion spreading across their faces. The Apache warriors took advantage of the pause. From behind rocks and bushes they made small noises, branches snapping, leaves rustling, shadows moving. It was enough to make the gang feel watched, surrounded, and uncertain. One man shouted, thinking he had seen someone, but there was no one there. His words carried on the wind, spreading doubt to the others. The cowboy remained calm, his eyes following every movement. He knew that patience was as powerful as force. By letting the gang believe they were being watched, he had already gained the upper hand. The gang members began whispering among themselves, questioning their own senses. They could not see the warriors, but they could feel their presence. Fear, quiet and creeping, had begun to take hold. As evening deepened, the cowboy gave the next signal. This time it was a subtle whistle, soft but carried clearly to the trained ears of the warriors. Several warriors moved closer to small ridges, positioning themselves to strike at the right moment. They did not attack yet. The goal was confusion, delay, and distraction. Every step they took was careful, precise, and practiced. They were a single unit, guided by experience and trust. The gang, meanwhile, became restless. Their leader shouted orders, trying to organize his men. "Keep moving," he barked. "Nothing is here yet. Don't be afraid of shadows." But the words did little to calm the others. The small noises, the rustling, the glimpses of movement all suggested that they were being watched by more people than they could see. Their confidence began to waver. The cowboy lowered his rifle, waiting for the right moment. He could see which gang members were most fearful, which were reckless, and which were still confident. This knowledge was power. By understanding their strengths and weaknesses, he could control the battle without risking unnecessary danger. Then the first real clash began. A small group of gang members moved too close to another trap the cowboy had set, a shallow ditch covered with brush. One rider's horse stumbled, throwing him slightly, but not harming him seriously. The others saw the fall and paused. It was a small victory, but enough to show the cowboy that his strategy was working. Panic spread slowly, like a wave across the group. The Apache warriors began moving more visibly now, but still with care. They created the impression of a larger force approaching. From one ridge, a warrior shouted loudly, a call that echoed across the plains. Another beat a small drum on a rock, creating vibrations that the wind carried. The gang could now see more signs of life, more movement than they had expected. Their confidence turned into worry, and their worry quickly turned into fear. The cowboy stayed low, observing. He knew that fear could be more powerful than weapons. The gang had horses, rifles, and numbers, but they did not have strategy, patience, or unity. The cowboy and the warriors had each step planned, each reaction considered. Even a single mistake by the gang would give them an advantage. One of the gang's men, feeling brave, tried to move forward and confront what he thought were hidden enemies. A well-placed signal from the cowboy sent another group of warriors into position. They did not attack directly, but moved in ways that suggested they were surrounding the intruder. The man froze, unsure which way to turn. He looked back at his companions, and the hesitation was clear. The first cracks had appeared in the gang's unity. As the sun sank lower, the cowboy decided it was time to increase the pressure. He moved slightly, using the rise as cover, and fired a single, precise shot into the air. The sound echoed, sharp and commanding. The gang flinched. They could not see where the shot came from, only that it had been accurate. More importantly, the shot was a signal to the Apache warriors. From their hidden positions, the warriors began a carefully planned series of distractions. Some created sudden noises, startling the horses. Others moved in sight of the gang, giving the illusion of numbers far greater than 77. Every action was coordinated, designed to control the gang's perception without exposing the warriors to real danger. The cowboy continued to monitor every move, adjusting signals and giving guidance silently. The gang tried to regroup. Their leader shouted again, attempting to command his men, but the confusion was too great. Horses were nervous, riders were unsure, and shadows seemed to move where no one should be. They had expected an easy victory, but now they faced uncertainty at every step. The cowboy smiled faintly, knowing that the tide was already turning. The first real confrontation had shown the power of patience, preparation, and clever use of the land. Night began to fall, casting long shadows and deepening the mystery of the hills. The cowboy moved back toward his cabin briefly, checking supplies and ensuring his weapons were ready. He could hear faint sounds in the distance, shouts, the snort of horses, the movement of men, but they were no longer confident. They were cautious, uncertain, and worried about forces they could not see. The Apache warriors continued their silent movements. Some climbed to higher ridges, keeping watch over the gang's positions. Others stayed hidden near the paths, ready to intervene if necessary. The cowboy knew that the coming night would be the most critical part of the battle. Darkness would make it easier for the gang to feel trapped and alone, and easier for his allies to control the situation. The cowboy also thought about the families in the nearby settlements. Many were still watching from a distance, unsure what would happen. He knew that their safety depended not just on weapons, but on strategy, intelligence, and timing. Courage alone was not enough. Careful planning was what would protect them. He felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that he had prepared for every possibility. The gang had begun to realize that the man they thought helpless was anything but. They had walked into a plan they could not see, guided by a mind far sharper than their own. They had underestimated the cowboy, and now they paid the price with confusion, doubt, and fear. Every step they took was slower, every command questioned, every movement uncertain. The balance of power had shifted without a single serious injury. The cowboy watched the shadows grow longer as night approached. The first clash had been small but meaningful. It had tested the gang's nerves, disrupted their confidence, and proved that strategy could overcome numbers. The next phase, he knew, would require even greater focus. He would need to coordinate his allies, control the movements of the gang, and ensure that every action reinforced the impression of overwhelming strength. As the first stars appeared in the sky, the cowboy felt a quiet sense of readiness. The gang was disoriented, the Apache warriors were in position, and the land itself seemed to be on his side. Every trap, every movement, every signal had worked so far. The night ahead would be long and demanding, but he was ready. He had patience, skill, and allies he could trust. The cowboy's mind was clear. The battle had begun, but it was only the first phase. The gang would soon learn that what they assumed was weakness was actually strength. They had underestimated a man, his knowledge, and the loyalty of 77 warriors. They had believed he was helpless. They would soon discover that they had walked into a plan carefully designed to turn fear, confusion, and strategy into victory. And so, as darkness fell over the plains, the quiet hills held a tense calm. The cowboy and his allies waited, ready for the next moves that would decide the fate of the gang. The first clash had tested courage, nerves, and skill. The night ahead would test them even further. But the cowboy was ready, the warriors were ready. And the gang, foolishly confident at first, had no idea what awaited them. The first shadows of night had settled over the plains, turning the hills into dark shapes against the fading glow of the sun. The cowboy stood quietly on a rise, his eyes scanning the movements of the gang below. They were no longer confident. Confusion and fear had begun to take hold, and the cowboy knew that this was the moment to press the advantage. His 70 Apache allies were hidden in strategic positions, ready to act. Every step of the gang was now being carefully observed, every misstep anticipated. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the faint sounds of movement across the plains. Horses snorted nervously, and the gang members muttered among themselves. They were trying to regroup, trying to make sense of the strange noises, the sudden shadows, the signs that they were not alone. But the cowboy and his allies had already created the impression of a much larger force. Confusion was a weapon as sharp as any rifle, and the gang had fallen right into it. From his rise, the cowboy signaled to a small group of warriors to move closer to the gang's left flank. The movement was subtle, almost invisible in the dim light, but it created the illusion that they were closing in. Another group made noises from behind rocks on the right, rustling branches and whispering calls that carried in the wind. Every step was planned, every action part of a larger strategy to control the gang's perception. The gang leader, once so confident, now shouted orders in frustration. "Stay together! Don't let them separate us!" But the cowboy had anticipated this. The distractions were designed to divide them, and now their unity was faltering. A small group moved toward what they thought was safety, only to find a shallow ditch hidden by brush. One man stumbled and fell, and the others hesitated, unsure whether to help him or continue forward. The moment of hesitation was all the cowboy needed. The cowboy moved slightly, his rifle ready, and fired a precise shot into the ground near a horse. The sound echoed loudly, startling the animal and causing it to rear. The rider struggled to control it, while the rest of the gang froze. From their hidden positions, the Apache warriors responded instantly. They made sudden movements, appearing briefly to the gang before disappearing behind rocks and trees. It was enough to suggest overwhelming numbers, keeping the gang constantly on edge. As night deepened, the battle of perception became as important as the actual fight. The cowboy understood that courage alone could not win this night. Strategy, timing, and the clever use of the land were equally important. The gang had no idea how carefully the cowboy had studied every hill, every trail, every rock where his allies could hide. They had walked into a carefully prepared plan that controlled their movements without exposing the warriors to real danger. A sudden noise drew the gang's attention to the right. One of the warriors had thrown a small rock into a dry creek bed, creating a sharp sound that echoed through the canyon. The gang spun toward it, guns raised, but saw nothing. Another sound came from the left, branches breaking as if someone had stepped over them. The gang moved cautiously, trying to stay together, but every move they made was anticipated. The cowboy watched and adjusted his signals, guiding the warriors silently. The tension grew with each passing moment. The gang's horses were restless, their riders nervous, and their confidence shattered. They had expected an easy target, but now they faced what seemed like an endless series of threats. Every shadow, every sound, every movement was magnified in their minds. The cowboys' plan was working perfectly. Control their fear, control their movement, and slowly wear them down without unnecessary risk. Then the cowboy decided it was time to increase the pressure. He raised his rifle, signaling to another group of warriors to take more visible positions. A few appeared briefly on a ridge silhouetted against the fading sky, enough for the gang to see them but not close enough to attack. The sight of these figures made the gang's leader shout in disbelief. "There are more than we thought," he exclaimed, his voice tinged with fear. The others began to doubt, arguing among themselves. Confusion now ruled their actions. The cowboy used the moment to move closer to the edge of the rise. He fired another warning shot, this one aimed to demonstrate precision and control rather than harm. The sound carried through the night, echoing across the plains. The gang ducked instinctively, unsure of where the shot had come from. That shot, small as it was, reinforced the illusion of overwhelming force. The gang had begun to believe that they were surrounded by more men than actually existed. The Apache warriors moved with calm efficiency. One group created sudden noise behind the gang, while another shifted to the left, giving the impression of encirclement. The gang tried to respond, but their movements were slow and uncertain. They could not see the warriors, could not anticipate their strategy, and could not regain the confidence they had lost. Every step they took was controlled, subtly guided by the cowboy's plan. Meanwhile, the cowboy's mind was already thinking ahead. He knew that the battle would soon reach a critical point, the moment when the gang's confusion could turn into full retreat. He signaled to another small group of warriors to move into positions where they could prevent escape and maintain the illusion of complete encirclement. Timing was crucial. Too early, and the gang might notice the trap. Too late, and they could regroup. But the cowboy had calculated everything carefully. The gang leader, frustrated and panicked, made a reckless decision. He shouted for a charge toward the nearest hill, hoping to scatter the perceived attackers. But the cowboy had anticipated this. Warriors positioned along the hill responded with sudden movements, appearing as if a much larger force was advancing. The gang hesitated, their momentum lost, and the cowboy knew the moment of advantage had arrived. The first real attempt to flee ended in further hesitation. One horse slipped on the uneven ground, causing its rider to stumble. Another rider tried to circle back to help him, only to find that the path he had chosen was partially blocked by hidden warriors. Every small action reinforced the gang's fear and uncertainty. The cowboy watched, calculating, ready to respond to any real threat, but hoping to maintain control through strategy rather than direct confrontation. Night had fully arrived now, and the plains were bathed in silver light from the rising moon. The cowboy and the Apache warriors were nearly invisible, moving silently among the shadows, using every rock, tree, and hill as cover. The gang's confusion had reached its peak. They argued, shouted, and pointed fingers at imagined threats. The cowboy knew that this psychological advantage was as important as any physical action. Control the mind, and the body follows. The cowboy raised his hand slightly, signaling the final phase of the night's plan. Small fires had been set in hidden positions to create the illusion of campfires and more men. Shadows flickered across the hills, making the gang believe that reinforcements were arriving constantly. The illusion was perfect. The gang's morale, already fragile, now began to break completely. One by one, the gang members tried to retreat, but every path seemed blocked, every movement anticipated. The cowboy's strategy had worked. He had not needed to risk unnecessary danger. His preparation, his patience, and his careful use of allies had turned the tide. The gang, once confident and arrogant, was now scattered, unsure, and afraid. The cowboy allowed himself a small smile. The first night of confrontation had tested courage, skill, and patience. The gang had underestimated him, walked into a carefully prepared plan, and discovered that appearances can be deceiving. The cowboy's strength had never been in numbers alone, but in intelligence, preparation, and the loyalty of those who trusted him. As the night continued, the cowboy and his allies maintained control. The Apache warriors moved silently to ensure the gang could not regroup, while the cowboy watched from the rise, ready to respond if any real threat emerged. Every move reinforced the illusion of overwhelming force. The gang's leader, exhausted and defeated in spirit, finally signaled a retreat, knowing that the night had been lost. By the time the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the gang had disappeared into the distance, their arrogance replaced by fear and uncertainty. The cowboy stood quietly on the rise, observing the plains. No lives had been unnecessarily harmed, no blood spilled, yet victory had been achieved. The combination of clever strategy, disciplined allies, and the careful use of the land had proved more powerful than any brute force. The Apache warriors returned to his side, silent and disciplined. The cowboy nodded to them, a quiet acknowledgement of their bravery and skill. Together, they had turned the night into a lesson. Appearances can be deceiving. Confidence without preparation is dangerous, and unity combined with intelligence is stronger than numbers alone. The cowboy returned to his cabin, his heart steady and his mind calm. The battle of the night was over, but he knew that vigilance was always necessary on the frontier. The gang might try again, and new challenges could arise. But for now, he allowed himself a quiet satisfaction. He had faced what seemed like impossible odds and had won, not through force alone, but through courage, preparation, and the loyalty of 77 warriors who had trusted him completely. The first light of dawn stretched across the plains, painting the hills and valleys in soft gold and pink. The cowboy stood quietly on a small rise, taking in the scene. The gang that had threatened his land was gone, their arrogance replaced by fear and confusion. Their retreat had been complete, and the frontier had been quiet once more. For the cowboy, victory was not measured in violence or destruction, but in the careful use of skill, patience, and strategy. He had defended his home, his allies, and the people nearby without unnecessary harm. The Apache warriors, 77 strong, emerged from the shadows of the hills and valleys. Silent and disciplined, they gathered around the cowboy, their presence both reassuring and powerful. The night's battle had been tense, challenging, and exhausting, but it had also proven the strength of their alliance. They had worked together seamlessly, following signals, anticipating movements, and controlling the gang's actions with skill rather than brute force. The cowboy looked at the warriors, his eyes reflecting quiet pride and gratitude. He knew that their loyalty had been earned over years of trust, respect, and mutual support. They had chosen to stand with him not out of fear, but because he had treated them fairly, shared their knowledge, and defended their honor in the past. That trust had been the cornerstone of the victory. Without it, the battle might have ended very differently. The settlers in the nearby town who had watched from a distance during the night began to emerge cautiously. Some were curious, others cautious, but all were impressed by the calm and confidence with which the cowboy and his allies had handled the situation. They had expected a simple man to be helpless, but what they saw now was far different. They saw strategy, courage, and the power of careful planning. They saw that the cowboy had never truly been alone. The cowboy walked among the warriors, checking that everyone was unharmed and in good spirits. He spoke quietly, offering praise and guidance, reinforcing the sense of unity that had carried them through the night. Even the most skilled warriors appreciated recognition from someone they respected, and his words strengthened the bond between them. They had faced fear together, controlled chaos with precision, and emerged victorious. That bond, forged in trust and shared purpose, was stronger than any weapon. The gang's retreat had left the plains empty, but the lessons of the night lingered. The cowboy knew that fear and respect often traveled faster than any story could. The gang would carry the memory of the disciplined, clever man they had underestimated, and the unseen allies who had outmaneuvered them. That knowledge would spread through the frontier, and future threats would think twice before underestimating him. Strategy, patience, and courage had created a reputation that brute force alone could not achieve. The cowboy returned to his cabin as the sun climbed higher. Inside, he checked his supplies, cleaned his weapons, and prepared for the day ahead. Though the immediate danger had passed, the frontier was never without challenges. He knew that being ready for the unexpected was part of life here. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The night had been long, the plans complex, but the result was clear. His land, his allies, and the nearby settlers were safe. As the day progressed, the settlers approached cautiously, offering gratitude and praise. They had seen how the cowboy had handled the threat, and they realized that appearances could be deceiving. A man who seemed alone could be more powerful than many who relied only on numbers or weapons. The cowboy listened politely, offering reassurance and sharing small insights without boasting. His strength was quiet, disciplined, and thoughtful. That humility, combined with skill, made him respected far more than fear could. The Apache warriors gathered near a small creek to rest and refresh themselves. The cowboy joined them briefly, sharing water and words of encouragement. They had moved as one during the night, trusting signals, anticipating movements, and keeping the gang off balance without unnecessary danger. The cowboy knew that their calm efficiency and loyalty had made the victory possible. Each warrior had contributed to the plan, each action deliberate, each decision carefully executed. The night had tested courage, patience, and skill, and together they had succeeded. As the day continued, the cowboy took a walk across his land. He inspected the paths, the small traps, and the vantage points he had used during the night. Everything was as it should be, a testament to careful preparation and attention to detail. He thought about the lessons learned. Patience and strategy often outweighed brute force. Trust and loyalty could achieve what fear could not, and careful planning could turn the most challenging situations into victories. The land itself had been an ally, providing cover, advantage, and opportunities that only someone who knew it well could see. The settlers began to talk quietly among themselves, realizing that the man they had thought helpless was anything but. They shared stories of his bravery, his careful strategy, and the invisible allies who had helped him. Word of the night's events would spread quickly, and the cowboy's reputation would grow. He had defended his land not through recklessness, but through intelligence, preparation, and unity. That reputation, carefully earned, would make future threats hesitate before challenging him. Even the gang, now far away, would carry the memory of the night. They had believed they would face a lone man and had instead encountered a disciplined, clever force that anticipated every move. Fear, confusion, and respect had replaced their confidence. The cowboy had not needed to rely solely on weapons. He had relied on patience, planning, and the loyalty of those who trusted him. That lesson, learned through experience, would follow them for the rest of their lives. The cowboy returned to his cabin in the late afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the plains. Inside, he took a moment to rest and reflect. He had faced what seemed impossible, and through strategy, patience, and courage, he had prevailed. His mind was calm, his heart steady, and his spirit satisfied. Victory had been achieved not through recklessness, but through careful thought and trusted allies. As evening approached, the cowboy walked out of his cabin once more, watching the sun set behind the hills. The Apache warriors stood nearby, their presence a silent reminder of loyalty, discipline, and trust. Together they had faced fear, controlled chaos, and protected not only their land, but the people around them. The cowboy knew that the lessons of the night would remain with him, guiding future decisions and strengthening the bonds that had carried them to victory. The settlers, now reassured and grateful, began returning to their homes, carrying with them stories of the cowboy and the warriors who had defended the frontier. They spoke of courage, skill, and unity, realizing that strength was not always measured by numbers or weapons, but by preparation, intelligence, and loyalty. The cowboy listened quietly, knowing that the true reward was the safety and respect of the people he had protected. As the stars appeared in the sky, the cowboy and the Apache warriors gathered briefly to acknowledge the night's success. They had faced danger, uncertainty, and fear together, and their unity had turned the tide. The cowboy knew that trust and loyalty were as powerful as any weapon, and that courage, combined with strategy, could overcome almost any challenge. Together they had proven that appearances could be deceiving, and that a man who seemed alone could be stronger than any force that underestimated him. The night passed quietly, and by morning, The frontier had returned to its usual calm. The cowboy walked among the hills, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. The gang had been defeated without unnecessary bloodshed. The land was safe, and the bonds between the cowboy and the Apache warriors had grown stronger. He had faced the impossible and emerged victorious, not through reckless action, but through careful planning, patience, and unity. Word of the night's events spread throughout the settlements and beyond. The cowboy's reputation grew, not just as a skilled marksman, but as a clever strategist, a disciplined leader, and a man who earned the trust and loyalty of 77 Apache warriors. His story would be remembered as a lesson in courage, preparation, and the power of unity. Those who had once thought him helpless now knew the truth. He was never alone, and strength often comes in ways that cannot be measured by numbers alone. The cowboy returned to his quiet life, his cabin now a symbol of safety and cleverness rather than weakness. He continued to watch over his land, his allies, and the nearby settlements, always prepared, always patient, and always ready to defend what mattered. The Apache warriors remained his friends and partners, their bond unbroken by the events of the night. Together they had shown that courage, loyalty, and strategy could overcome any threat. And so, the frontier remained peaceful, at least for now. The cowboy had proven that appearances could be deceiving, that a clever mind and loyal allies were more powerful than brute force, and that patience and preparation could turn fear into a tool of victory. The man who had once seemed helpless was now respected, not through fear, but through skill, courage, and the quiet power of unity. In the end, the cowboy stood on a rise overlooking his land, the Apache warriors beside him, and the sun rising on a new day. He had faced what others thought impossible, and he had triumphed. The frontier was safe, the settlements secure, and the legend of the cowboy and his 70 Apache allies would live on, a reminder that true strength often comes from courage, trust, and careful planning, rather than numbers alone.